Tom, I'm a bit worried how much carbon removal is infiltrating my mind.
Okay.
I visited a friend's house the other day and they have a really big garden, and my first thought was, I wonder if this garden is big enough to have a biochar plant in the bottom of it.
And do you think it was?
It might be a bit of a squeeze, but I think we could definitely look into it.
It's funny you say that because I'm also kind of just seeing how I can, I guess, inject carbon removal topics into everything that I do, whether it's like hanging out with friends or at work.
Are you sat at the pub with a pint in front of you and your mates are like, Tom, do you want another one? And you go, let me just sequester this beer and store it with permanence in my digestive system.
Well, it wouldn't be very permanent, would it? It's actually thinking about it, we are all mini CDL facilities in a way, because we all hold carbon, don't we? As long as we're alive, we'll be holding a certain amount of carbon in our bodies. So we effectively are
That's
mini
true.
carbon stores.
So if you ever feel like you're having a bad day, just remind yourself that if you've done nothing at all, you've at least stored some carbon, and the world is grateful for that.
And we should all be paid for that.
Hello and welcome to the Carbon Removal Show. I'm Emily Swaddle.
I'm Tom Praviti.
And this week's episode is about public perceptions of carbon removal.
Let's get into it.
Okay, Tom, this feels like the moment in the season where we need to just take a breath, pause for a second, and check in with ourselves and check in with our audience.
Yes, definitely. Let's take a step off this high-speed treadmill we've been sprinting on for the last couple of episodes.
Yes, exactly. We've rattled through the past 7 episodes. We've had examples of carbon removal solutions, problems, nuances, more solutions, building a business, scaling the industry. And I think we just need to stop and ask, how do we feel about all this? Dear listeners out there, how do you feel about all this? How do you feel, Tom?
Honestly, I actually feel really excited. I've loved learning about these different technologies and businesses emerging in the space. It's all super inspiring, firstly, and it actually helps me imagine a future where I guess carbon isn't the enemy. I just feel optimistic.
Nice. That's really good to hear.
What about you? How do you feel, Emily?
How do I feel? I don't know how to feel, Tom. Some of the time I feel what you described, but I oscillate between that, between the inspired excitement and just a sort of terrified hopelessness.
Okay.
I just feel sad that we're in the situation that we're in with the climate crisis. I feel sad that the systems in which we live and work do not make it easy to develop or, implement solutions, especially solutions that aren't just going to cause more problems down the road. And I feel frustrated that there are solutions out there, and yet we're still disagreeing even on this whole question of carbon removal itself. It feels like such a shame. But carbon removal is a bit of a touchy subject, and especially, in my experience, it's ironic, but especially among environmentalist groups.
Okay, so here's a question. Off the back of some of what you've just said, how has your perception changed over the course of the season?
Good question. I mean, it definitely has, learning about all these things and talking to the amazing people we've spoken to, it couldn't have stayed the same, really. But I think I just go back and forth a million times, 1 minute learning about how essential carbon removal is, and then the next minute being reminded of how complex it is and how nuanced it is and how careful we have to be. It's a bit of a roller coaster, if I'm honest.
I can totally empathise with what you're saying here because it is complex, it is nuanced, and I would imagine a lot of our listeners are probably feeling the same way. So thank you for bringing that to the mic today.
Thanks for listening, Tom.
I'm always here. I've got 2 ears. So
I thought you were going to say I'm contractually obliged.
That's too. But what would also be nice would be to actually hear from our listeners. How are you guys feeling about this space?
Yeah, that would be nice.
So please do reach out to us on Twitter. You know our handle, but I'll say it again, RestoredCC. Search for the Carbon Removal Show and you'll no doubt find us. And just tell us how you're feeling. Aptly, today's episode is in fact about the public perception of carbon removal. We want to ask questions like, How does the public feel about this emerging industry? Why does that matter? And can we, just by talking about it, actually make a difference?
You know what else, Tom? This episode is actually going to be a bit of a double whammy. We're sort of doubling up on our magic formula with the guests that we've got on the episode today.
Oh, yeah. Pray tell. Give me some more info.
Well, I mean, as you know, every episode of the Carbon Removal Show has an Emily, a Tom, and right in front of us, a Mike.
Mm-hmm.
This episode has 2 Emilys, 2 Toms, and an extra Mike, as in Michael, not as in microphone.
Wow. Emily, I think in another life you would have done quite well as a comedian.
What do you mean in another life? I've still got plenty of this life left. I could still do it.
So, Emily, you mentioned your sadness at the state of the climate right now. That sense of how did we even get here?
Yeah, it can be pretty disheartening, to say the least.
Definitely. And you're actually not the only one who feels like that. We spoke to Mike Childs, who's the head of science, policy, and research at Friends of the Earth. And his initial reaction to the idea of needing carbon removal in the first place was quite similar.
What kind of mess have we got ourselves into, in that we're now not only having to talk about not putting more carbon pollution in the air, we're having to talk about how to remove the pollution we put into the air. And we wouldn't have been in this space if we'd listened to the first reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, 3 decades ago. We would have already started that journey of reducing our emissions and trying to bring them in line to what would be a kind of safer operating space for humanity. But we didn't listen to them. And so over that period, instead, we poured out vast amounts of greenhouse gases, continuing to do that. And so we have to now think about how can we remove that carbon from the atmosphere, as well as trying to stop more carbon going into the atmosphere. So I guess in an emotional sense, it's a kind of a deep sigh or bang your head against a brick wall. Why did we get in this mess? But we are in this mess and we've got to get out of it. So we've got to have serious conversations about, so what does carbon removal mean? How can it be done fairly? How can we make sure it doesn't give a license to operate to carry on polluting? Those are the big questions around carbon removal, I think, now, because there is absolutely no doubt we need to remove vast amounts of carbon pollution from the atmosphere.
It's actually reassuring to hear Mike echo a lot of the questions that we've posed over the course of this season. We've talked about how important these points are and how they need to be held in mind throughout the development of this whole industry. They're ongoing conversations. I do totally relate to Mike's reluctant enthusiasm here. It's kind of a helpful reminder of the reasons behind many people's reluctance to get super excited about carbon removal.
In October this year, Mike co-authored a paper for Friends of the Earth entitled A Dangerous Distraction: Why Offsetting Will Worsen the Climate and Nature Emergencies. Naturally, this paper caught our attention, so we asked Mike to expand on his thesis for us.
Carbon offset at a basic level is about saying, for every tonne of carbon you put in the atmosphere, you remove 1 tonne of carbon. And at a very simple level, that all sounds very sensible. At the most basic level, one of the major problems with it is it assumes we have a choice of doing A or B. We have a choice about reducing our pollutions by removing 1 tonne of carbon, instead of recognising we need to reduce our emissions and we need to remove carbon. We need to do everything, not choose between A and B. But there's also one very significant area of challenge, is that fossil fuels that are buried carbon that have been locked away in the Earth's crust for many, many, many years. When we burn that carbon will remain in the atmosphere for hundreds, thousands of years. If we talk about planting trees or restoring a habitat to draw down that carbon, there is no way we can guarantee that carbon will stay locked up, even for decades, let alone hundreds or thousands of years. So offsetting, when you're looking at nature-based solutions or natural carbon offsetting, these things don't equate. A tonne of fossil fuel carbon in the atmosphere doesn't equate to a tonne of carbon temporarily captured in a plant. Yet a large proportion of the carbon offset markets is doing exactly that. It's saying you can fly, you can drive, you can do X, Y, and Z because we'll plant a tree or we'll restore a habitat. And there is a kind of dark history to the carbon offsetting world. If you look back to the very early days of the United Nations scheme, the Clean Development Mechanism, you had factories being built effectively to release hydrofluorocarbons, potent greenhouse gases, because they can make a bomb by selling them as offsets. So, that's probably the worst, most egregious example of something that's gone wrong. But the market has also been full of offsetting being used to, in theory, fund projects that would have gone ahead already, or overclaiming of the amount of carbon that may be captured through a scheme. So, there is a long, dark storyline to carbon offsetting. But that hasn't gone away. That's still there today. And fundamentally, offsetting is still being used as a way not of saying, how do we deal with the residual emissions, those emissions we can't deal with, those remaining things. We've done our utmost, but we've got this bit left. How do we deal with that? It's not being used in that context. Far too much offsetting is being used as a reason for business as usual. And that's really harmful for those small numbers of companies who are genuinely trying to get investment into real projects that would genuinely be additional, genuinely lock up carbon for a long time, and genuinely only want them to be used for those really tough residual emissions that can't be eliminated.
These reasons for distrusting carbon offsets do seem really legitimate. We've touched on them before, and there are real dangers, so I totally get it.
Yes, but I can't help but feel that bundling all of our past, present, and future offset techniques just under the same umbrella is just going to hinder innovation and progress in this industry. It's almost ironic to me that this paper is called A Dangerous Distraction, because it feels as if focusing on the things that have historically gone wrong, or the cheating that's perhaps occurred in the industry in the past, is actually a dangerous distraction from what needs to be done in the space going forwards.
A dangerous distraction is basically saying, by looking at this thing, we're looking at the wrong thing. And Friends has been saying that for 10 years or more, until ahead of the Copenhagen conference. The focus absolutely needs to be on carbon reduction. And at the moment, carbon offsets are being used as a conversation piece to allow business as usual. So by saying, let's not talk about carbon offsets, let's talk about reductions, we're having the conversation on the right space. That isn't to say that at some point we don't need to talk more about carbon removal and carbon offsets. We do. But at the moment, it's a distraction from the real job at hand, which is to say, how do we reduce emissions as much as possible?
Mike and I agree fundamentally on this reduction point. Offsetting through carbon removal should not give us a license to move away from decarbonisation efforts. I think it's just that question of timing. We know we need to get to the gigaton scale by 2050 at the latest, and to get there, we must scale the industry from today, not put it on pause and only turn our attention to it when we need it, because then I fear it's going to be too little too late.
Yeah, I agree, Tom. I think you're right. I do think we're running out of time to still be disagreeing on this. We must consider decarbonisation and carbon removal as simultaneous challenges, not one and then the other. And then I suppose the question becomes, alongside making sure that it isn't an excuse for business as usual, the question is there enough public and political attention to maintain momentum on both the decarbonisation race and the carbon removal race in parallel? Like, is the pie big enough for everyone to get a slice? And this isn't just about attention. Obviously, we know that where attention goes, money soon follows. We obviously talked about this a lot in the last episode, but Mike had some ideas for financing that we hadn't thought of already.
I mean, the reality is that the scale question is something that's a challenge, isn't it? And one of the big challenges, of course, with direct air capture is that's the only thing it's doing. There's no kind of byproduct you can sell out the back of that. So it's just, in fact, it is just a payback. It's a payback from our failures. And we, this generation, have to say, yeah, we failed. We didn't do what we should have done 30 years ago. And now we're going to put our hands in our pockets and we're going to fund this technology. There are absolutely alternatives to carbon marketplace. Firstly, the world isn't necessarily short of money. And the most obvious thing is a recognition about just how deep governments found their pockets were as a result of the COVID crisis. So money can be found. There are also routes that, for example, the polluter pays principle, taxing the fossil fuel firms, for example, so raising money that way. But there's also about how we allocate our existing money. So at the risk of coming across some kind of 60s hippie peacenik, which perhaps I am on my soul, we spend vast amounts of money on defence across the world. And actually, what direct air capture is, it's about protecting our planet and making it habitable from the ravages of climate change. That seems to me as good an argument for investment as there is in defence, for example. We shouldn't need to say, okay, the only way we can allow this technology to develop is by allowing people to continue to pollute. It's exactly the wrong way of looking at it.
I actually think there's something to this argument of considering the fight against carbon pollution a defence issue.
What a flipping of the script that would be. Just imagining it right now. We could start a campaign like #Don'tAttackByDAC or something like that.
I love it. Let's get it trending. #Don'tAttackByDAC. Tag your local representative here.
It is interesting to me, though, to hear that the resistance here isn't necessarily with carbon removal itself. It goes back to the offset marketplace. Mike's concern is that corporates and governments will turn a blind eye to critical reductions and just look to use this get out of jail free card with offsets. This idea of thinking in a different way about how we can integrate carbon removal without the need for an offset marketplace is actually a really interesting one to me.
One thing I really admire about the Friends of the Earth approach is that they aren't just thinking about one problem in isolation. Mike described how systems thinking is integral to Friends of the Earth campaigning.
Firstly, it's brought a strong evidence base to its campaigning. It's always had that kind of approach to campaigning. And secondly, it's always been about people and the planet, not just about wildlife, not just about wild spaces, but about people as well. You can't solve environmental problems without solving problems around poverty, around people's access to resources, about people's voice to be heard. You need to look at this from a holistic view, and you can't solve one environmental issue without recognizing it's interconnected to another environmental issue. And from doing that, you can then look at the solutions that deliver holistically as well. So solutions that can not only solve a problem, environmental problem, but can also create jobs or create wealth or create opportunities for people. So that holistic viewpoint, I think, is important when we're looking at solutions as well as problems.
This holistic approach is vital and also so complicated. Making sure everyone's voice is heard is really noble, and at the same time, it kind of feels impossible.
Well, we cannot guarantee that everyone's voices will be heard, but getting everyone involved in the conversation, that's kind of why we're here. We are using this show to lay the groundwork of understanding so that more and more voices can join the discussion.
And even if we're just a drop in the ocean of the climate media, we hope that we can cause a ripple effect that will reach far and wide.
The thing is, Tom, we cannot pretend that we're the only ones making ripples in this ocean. Honestly, there are waves coming from all directions. Here's Dr. Emily Cox.
We've sort of won the science communication challenge around climate change. Especially in the UK, there are very few people who don't believe that climate change is happening. There are slightly more people who believe that it's happening, but that it's not caused by humans. But if you look at surveys, the vast majority of people not only believe that climate change is happening, but they believe that it's extremely severe. They believe that it's worrying. They believe that we really need to do something about it. And that is a huge success for science communication, and over actually quite a short period of time. Of course, the challenging thing now is to start communicating what we should do about it, which is much more complicated and much more tied up with competing values and things like this. And this is really the challenge that we're dealing with at the moment.
Dr. Emily Cox is a researcher in environmental policy and social psychology at Cardiff University in Wales. She set us up nicely with a little reminder of how far we've come in science communication around the climate crisis.
Yeah, thank goodness for that. What a nightmare it would be if we were still seriously battling against climate denialism at this stage. We're lucky, really, that we can create this show based on the assumption that our listeners will all be on the same page when it comes to at least the basic issue.
Indeed. Now, Emily's research focuses on public perceptions of new technologies. One example of this being carbon removal. She talked us through the results of her study titled Public Perceptions of Carbon Dioxide Removal in the United States and the United Kingdom, which was published in July of 2020.
The first statistic we report is the level of awareness, which is It's not surprising that people haven't heard of this stuff. We have 9.6% in the US and 5.7% in the UK who said that they knew either a great deal or a fair amount. And we don't know this, but that number might actually be higher than the reality because this was a self-reported item, right? And it might be that someone's maybe vaguely heard of carbon dioxide removal in some article years ago, and they decided that that means they know a fair amount about it. These are quite low awareness figures, and this is what we were expecting. We found that by and large, there weren't very many differences between the different countries that we studied. We did find that our UK sample had perceived more benefits from carbon dioxide removal. And this was a slightly surprising result. We had to look into this to try and figure out why that might be. And Elspeth Spence conducted an analysis basically showing that part of it was connected to climate change concern. So people in the UK are more concerned about climate change than people in the US. And this led to some slightly higher perceptions that carbon dioxide removal will have some benefits. This might seem quite obvious, but it's quite useful for us to know because it's not always the case that if you're more concerned about climate change, you're more supportive of climate mitigation measures. And the classic example is nuclear power, right? Nuclear power is a low carbon technology, and yet people who are more concerned about climate change are often more opposed to nuclear power. And so it's interesting to us to see that if you're more concerned about climate change, you're more likely to be supportive of carbon dioxide removal.
Oh, those numbers are pretty low. 5.7% in the UK. Oof.
It's also interesting that the study looked at why people hold certain perceptions around carbon dioxide removal, or CDR. The comparison with nuclear power is really telling in this case. Public perception can be influenced, in many ways.
Do you mean in the sense that nuclear still has a lot of PR problems because of other risks?
Yeah, the Fukushima disaster in 2011 no doubt played some sort of role here.
Yeah, it's true. When it comes to perception of carbon dioxide removal, a lot can change in a couple of years.
We conducted this survey in early 2019, and a lot has happened in 2 years, right? So this was, just to put it in context, this was before Extinction Rebellion made a big noise. This was before Greta Thunberg and the school strikes. This was obviously before COVID and all of that complete nightmare. It was before the UK introduced a net zero emissions target. An awful lot has changed. And my suspicion would be that if we did the same survey again, awareness would be higher because carbon dioxide removal's been in the media a little bit. My sense is that the controversy over it, particularly in the public domain, was, to my mind, practically non-existent a couple of years ago. I don't really think that it was on the public or the policy agenda, particularly at that time. I think things might have changed now. I think particularly with all of these commitments to net zero emissions, this has really put carbon dioxide removal front and center, because it's very, very difficult to see how some of these industries intend to reach net zero CO2 without relying on quite a lot of carbon dioxide removal somewhere, right? And I think that there is some controversy about this. And I hope that this has become more apparent in the public mind. Certainly to my mind, it's been in the media quite a bit, but of course I pay attention to certain bits of media.
I do wonder what impact our little podcast would have on those numbers. We should have had Emily do a survey before and after so we could see how far our ripple effect has travelled.
Yeah, we're certainly contributing to the conversation in any case. She touches on an interesting point at the end there about media echo chambers. Emily, you and we are too deeply involved in this field to really have an idea of how much a random member of the public who isn't involved in the climate movement in any way might be exposed to carbon removal lingo.
Yeah, that's very true. I've totally been second guessing myself for the past year, like since we started making this show. I've just been thinking, is it that the algorithm on my phone is just gradually showing me more and more carbon removal news? Or is it that there's genuinely more stuff out there on this topic cropping up every day? Man, I suppose I'll never know.
One of those mysteries of modern life, Emily. Despite the small numbers, there are some encouraging things to come out of Emily's research. It turns out that a lot of the nuances which we've been jabbering on about over the last few episodes are actually pretty intuitive.
People have this really intuitive understanding that the more diverse the technologies you've got, then the lower the risk, right? Because if one of them fails, then it means that others can step in to take their place, and it means that you're not doing too much of any one thing. And so people already have this intuitive understanding. I believe that people are going to push for that. The other thing we found in our work was that there's this really strong perception of, what's the point of doing carbon dioxide removal if simultaneously we're pumping out emissions at pace and not doing anything about it, right? So the two need to go hand in hand. People want it to be coherent. And the examples that our participants gave were more drilling for oil and gas, and also things like expanding airports, building new runways, things like that. It just seems completely bizarre in people's minds and in my mind that you could spend loads of money on carbon dioxide removal and then also spend loads of money on a new runway, right? And so I think that a lot of the things that I hope for the future of carbon dioxide removal are already there in the public perception. And I hope that people will continue to push for this stuff.
That's really good to hear, right? If these things are understood intuitively, then there's more chance that they're going to be considered throughout the development of the industry. I, for one, share Emily's hope that this is a good sign for things to come.
Yeah, me too. It's funny that people's fears or concerns are actually sort of reassuring us at this point. Like, at least they're the right fears and concerns. We can deal with these ones. We can work with this.
I think my greatest fear at the moment is that I'd see a lot of polarization happen in a lot of the world at the moment. And I think that there's a risk that carbon dioxide removal might get polarized. There are two ways in which this could happen. First of all, we could get a sort of for and against lobby, with some people saying we need loads of carbon dioxide removal right now, and other people saying we just shouldn't do it at all because it's really dangerous and it's the wrong thing for the planet. I don't think that debate is particularly helpful. It's not about whether we do it, it's about how we do it and where and how we can do it in the best way possible. The other polarization is between these idea of like nature-based solutions and what we've called in our paper engineered solutions. And it's a really tricky one because they obviously are different and you obviously do need to differentiate, but also the boundaries are extremely blurry. And I think that there's a real risk that we might end up falling into two camps, with some people acting like nature-based solutions are going to save the world and others acting like they're the wrong way to go because they can't sequester enough CO2 over long enough timeframes. Again, this doesn't help. We need both. We need to avoid these debates. We need to avoid this polarization. And we need the diverse portfolio that the general public are already really in favour of.
Oh, I fear this as well. I see it so much in the world right now. People essentially aiming for the same thing and ultimately getting caught up arguing over the how or, some little detail. It's really scary. For me, it feels like that old adage of being your own worst enemy.
I think it just comes back to what we've already mentioned of fighting for the public and political attention and funds. If not everyone can have a slice of the pie, then Emily, our little biochar bakery, suddenly finds itself in competition with a DAC plant down the road.
Yeah, I mean, isn't there enough to go around though? It would just be a real shame if that ended up taking up too much time and energy. Surely there's a version of the world where these things can coexist. That's what all of our guests have said we need. And now Emily has said the public knows it too. We need a diverse range of solutions.
Now, the final thing that Emily mentioned on the public's mind is another one of our favourites, timeframe.
One of the things that came out most surprisingly for us was this perception of urgency of climate change. People weren't talking about climate change as a long-term problem. People are talking about it as something that's here and now, and it's impacting their lives. The problem is that when you're talking about some really quite early stage technologies, people know that developing technologies takes ages, right? And so they're looking at these new technologies being like, yeah, but don't we need something a bit faster than that, right? Don't we need something kind of now rather than 20 years down the line? So that's why people were saying that it's not short term enough, basically, that they just won't be ready quickly enough to deal with this urgent problem. At the same time, though, people were saying that they kind of didn't feel that this stuff was going to be sustainable in the long run because, space would run out for CO2 storage, or because we would use up too much land. We would come up against biophysical limits to what we can actually remove from the atmosphere. Therefore, if we carry on pumping out these emissions at the pace that we are at the moment, we're not going to be able to do enough carbon dioxide removal to sort of keep up with that in the long term. And so this is why people said that it was kind of too short term, because it wasn't addressing these long term sustainability issues. And I think that was just a really fundamental tension in people's minds about how you go about dealing with that. And it's something that we're still considering, and we're still trying to figure out what the best response to this is. I think one aspect is, obviously, as I've said a few times, is we just need to do something about the emissions that we're putting out. If we are reducing emissions, then the concerns about carbon dioxide removal not being sustainable in the long term sort of reduce quite a lot. At the same time, if we manage to reduce emissions loads in the short term, it might buy us a little bit more time to kind of develop these technologies as we go through. And so this dilemma that people really pointed to, I think a lot of it can be solved by just looking at carbon dioxide removal as one very small component of what needs to be a much bigger and much more ambitious and much more joined up plan to reduce our emissions.
When putting together this podcast, something that quickly became apparent to us as climate conscious people with a nonetheless limited understanding of carbon removal was the importance of language. In our early conversations with potential guests, we kept discovering differences in the terminology people preferred, and some people even voiced quite strong opinions about wanting to use certain words over others when it came to this industry and some of the technologies.
Right. It certainly felt like a bit of a minefield when we were just still finding our feet. That is one of the reasons that I've been keen to sort of sprinkle our episodes with occasional language chats so others can learn from our early mistakes. That, and also because I truly believe that the language we use is super important and fascinating, and also I just know that you love them, Tom.
I can't lie, I really do. Quite possibly, single-handedly, my favourite part of the series.
Yes! What a win. And I suppose all of this came to a head when we started talking about what we would name this podcast that we'd spent months researching and pouring our hearts and souls into. Obviously, some of us were very tempted to opt for a pun. I mean, who doesn't love a pun? Certainly no one that works on this podcast, I'm sure. But even once we decided to go for something a bit more straight down the line, we had all sorts of questions about how we should even refer to the subject of the series. We started off with negative emissions, and we liked that because it seemed like a clear concept that people could grasp. But the word negative just felt a bit in conflict with the whole idea of, a climate positive message that we were setting out to achieve. It might seem like such a small thing, but it really matters when you're trying to build a brand or a podcast in our case. So we considered words like drawdown and net zero, but they either felt a bit too vague or just not sort of focused on a mission for us. Finally, we settled on good old carbon removal because, well, it does what it says on the tin. But as you're about to hear, even that isn't without its controversies.
But this whole subject of language is also about much more than what we call carbon removal and its various technologies. As we've been hearing, public perceptions are key both to getting support for the industry and to making sure it's done right. And as this is something so few people are aware of, finding the right words and concepts to talk and think about this space is super vital.
To dive into this more, we spoke with Tom Mansfield. Tom has a diverse background, previously working in sustainability and construction, but he's also a writer and a poet with a passion for language and communication. We got along very well. More recently, he studied facilitation, neurolinguistic programming, and the fascinating field of ecolinguistics. Now, some may say it's pretty niche, ecolinguistics, but if you've ever talked about environmental anything, you've used some form of ecolinguistics.
I mean, we're experiencing the power of ecolinguistics right now, aren't we?
Oh, yeah, always. Can you feel it? Tom Mansfield brought all of these skills together to found his consultancy, Pale Blue. He gave us an overview of ecolinguistics and how we might apply it.
It surfaces choices about language, ones that we're often unaware of. Because the more we use language, the more it just almost becomes sort of involuntary. We reach for terms and we don't sort of stop to take a fresh look at them. So the value of ecolinguistics for me is taking that pause and creating language choices. So it's very easy to try and sort of advocate for a particular word over another, but language is so slippery and it's context dependent. So I just want to sort of preface with that, because I will make some recommendations, but they work for me in certain contexts. I heard you talking about building community, and that's one that I always offer an alternative to, and offer the alternative of growing community. So as a process metaphor, building and growing are fundamentally different kinds of processes and activities, right? One's linear and the other is systemic. One's extractive and the other one is generative. So if you're building a community, the conceptual model you have for community is a construct that's made of modular parts, and they've been assembled by an outside designer in a top-down way. Now, these words rush by us and we say build, grow, whatever, but I really feel they make a difference, and they inform our expectations about how a community will behave, what it requires. And given that a community is made of organic entities like us, it seems more appropriate that we have an organic metaphor. So really what I'm doing a lot of the time with ecolinguistics and trying to apply it is I'm going around and I'm hunting for machine think is a phrase that I have for it, for industrial concepts like building instead of growing, and try to replace them with organic concepts, not because of some kind of trendiness or wholesomeness to do with organics, but actually because the original systems thinkers were indigenous cultures that were living in constant relationship to natural cycles and processes. And our period of industrialism, while it's given us these powerful gifts and tools of technology, I feel it's time now to kind of bring our technology back home and relearn or learn anew this sort of systems thinking.
As we were learning all of this terminology for the podcast, and even in, the years before, as we've both been working in sustainability-related fields, there's a tendency to just accept the words and phrases that seem to be most commonplace. But what Tom is suggesting is that we really think about the language that we're using, not only to challenge some of the assumptions that we might be making with it, but also because it can help focus our attention on things that we may have overlooked.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, it's such good stuff. I love it. I'm always thinking about language and how we use it, which I recognise not everyone does. But for me, Tom hits the nail on the head with the idea that the process of thinking about our language is almost as important as the words we use ourselves. Because language is often the beginning of sharing any idea. This obviously has a lot of significance for anyone who's setting up a venture in this space. Here's one example that Tom gave that I was particularly struck by.
Now, some work that I'm doing at the moment is on a project for a carbon removal accelerator. It has a working title of the Planetary Health Institute, and I hope it will be named that when it's instantiated legally. But initially, the working title was something like the Climate Repair Institute. So here's another example of health or healing and repair. Those are very, very different processes. When you repair something, it's fixed. But if something can be repaired, it also means that it's a system that is driven by linear cause and the parts can be separated. A system of health has multiple variants coming in on it all the time. And so if we don't have concepts that speak to systemic causation, we can't deal with systems level issues like the climate.
With this example, I think you can really see how important a name could be to public perceptions of an organization, as well as even how that organization conceives of its own role or mission over time. These are subtleties, but they're really important ones nonetheless.
With an eye on our own name, we apprehensively asked Tom what he thought about the phrase carbon removal.
I think removal is often felt as a kind of a negative thing. And I think climate work and sustainability, which is a poor term that we're getting beyond now, thankfully, both have their limitations because we're trying to transform a culture and civilization that's been reared on growth and increasing growth. The lived experience of that is consuming and obtaining more things, more stuff, more energy. So when we talk about sustaining, we kind of flatline that. And then when we talk about removals and negative emissions, I don't think it appeals to the mind that is focused on positive growth, expansion, progression, all of these sorts of things, right? So I think there's some cognitive dissonance there around carbon removals. Yet we know that we have to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. So it's a working term. Where I'm quite inspired, I heard this from the Carbon Removal Centre and from some other groups in this space, that rebalancing the carbon cycle is an agenda. So I connect that with the frame of health, or health of the atmosphere, health of the environment, right? That there's a rebalancing. How do things stay healthy? They self-regulate. So if we're rebalancing the carbon cycle, for me, that's a really powerful North Star. That's a beautiful goal for the greenhouse gas removal sector, to rebalance the carbon cycle, and know that balancing takes continual adjustments. So ultimately, if we can participate in the carbon cycle, I would like to hear language in the carbon removal space move to the carbon cycle space. There's an organic carbon cycle. Our challenge now is to build a technologically mediated carbon cycle on top of the organic one. And I don't think removal speaks to that clearly enough. But from where we are, meeting people where they are, we get carbon removal. So that works.
So is this it, Emily? Are we going to have to change the name of the podcast?
Well, Tom, it's never too late for a rebrand. I mean, Tom Mansfield did give us pause for thought here. I completely understand what he's saying. Removal could also imply that the carbon is somehow being taken away, never to be seen again. It doesn't speak to the whole process very effectively. I really connected to the idea of rebalancing our carbon cycle. What Tom described, that technology-mediated carbon cycle on top of the organic one, that's actually exactly how I imagine what we're aiming for. And I think it might help more people understand the role that these technologies could play over the coming years. Raising awareness of the carbon cycle itself with our terminology, I think it can only be a good thing. Listeners may have noticed that the top-level name of this series is Restored. Well, as well as being a bit of a pun on the idea of storage, carbon storage, we love a pun, I also think restoring speaks to this idea of finding balance and healing that Tom has been referring to.
Right. And ultimately, one also has to balance all of these considerations with what are people going to understand now? What words are they going to be searching for? Language change can happen suddenly or gradually, but it's hard for individuals or organizations to push for this on their own. We need to consider what language experts and businesses working in this space are using, as well as what language is likely to be best understood by those new to these ideas.
It's true. The whole concept of carbon removal is quite difficult to wrap your head around if you're new to it, or even if you're not that new to it. And we know that public awareness of it is low. It feels like having recognisable phrases up our sleeves can be really useful in communicating our ideas, even if they feel a little inadequate once we get up close and analyse them. Tom underlined why this whole question of language use is so important in this field in particular.
It will be natural for people to be kind of dismissive or not value this change in terminology that I'm advocating for. But we do know from psychology that the concepts that we use for relating to the world affect our behaviours, and they inform our expectations about how the world will respond to us, to our interactions. So if we're talking about saving the planet, we have a conceptual model where we are in some sense outside or separate from the planet as saviours. So we are no longer of the environment, we're doing something to it. We're an external agent. Whereas if you're healing the planet, you're a healing agent. It means you are in some kind of contact and reciprocation as an agent of healing. It's very different to being a saviour. Also, when something's saved, it's done. That's a terminal point. It's the same as a fight on climate change or a fight on anything. That's one that really bugs me, is that we're going to beat the climate into submission. We're going to win the war against carbon dioxide. It's a completely insane project, and it's the same thinking that's caused the problems we're dealing with now. Whereas healing the planet, healing the world is very different, because health is a systemic concept. And for a system to be healthy, it requires all of the subsystems to be healthy, requires me to be healthy to live in a healthy planet. This frame of health, or planetary health, I think is more empowering for people too. I think another thing about repair and fix and these kinds of technical industrial concepts, they're actually quite disempowering, because there's a narrative being propagated there that for the climate to be fixed, fixing or repairing something complicated requires technicians and specialists. It's not for everyone. Whereas health feels much more inclusive, because if a healthy planet requires all the individuals to be healthy, then it does require everyone's participation.
Saving the planet can sometimes feel like such an impossible task. And it also leads to that misconception that either we've solved the problem by 2030, 2050, whatever, or we haven't. That either we meet the 1.5 degrees and we're fine, or we exceed it and we're doomed. Healing the planet feels like a much more achievable, nuanced process that encompasses everything from removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to restoring our ecosystems. It's an ongoing process, in the same way that taking care of our own health continues throughout our life. And it even starts to put those questions of equity and justice at the core of the mission, making sure every element of the planet is healthy, all the systems and all the individuals.
And as Tom touched on, this process is going to involve everyone. Now, that's not to say that everyone needs to retrain tomorrow as an engineer or set up their own carbon removal business. But it does mean that everyone is involved somehow in this process, whether that's as citizens of democracies, as consumers, as investors, and simply as people living on this planet.
A big episode, Tom. I feel like we've blown up our perspective in this episode. We're not looking at individual things anymore. We're looking at the whole world and how they relate to carbon removal.
Yeah, we're thinking much more on the systems level here, which I'm kind of digging right now.
It's fun. And obviously, talking all this stuff about language is just, it's so joyful. I love it.
I wasn't such a big fan of language before we started this show, or the use of language, or thinking about the process of using language. And I feel like I've definitely had a change of heart. And off the back of the conversation with Tom, for example, it really has made me rethink how I use language on a day-to-day basis, not just in carbon removal conversations or just in climate conversations, but just conversations as a whole.
Yeah, that's really good to hear. I truly believe that the way we use language can have such an impact on so many other things. Tom was using it in terms of the way we think about how we relate to nature and how we relate to this crisis that we're currently in. And also how we involve people in that. And I think that as well, it can come back to what Emily Cox was saying about polarization. That question of battling against each other to win attention or funding or whatever it is, because we're worried that our specific niche of carbon removal needs those things more than another one. Those kinds of conversations can also be affected by the way that we use language and the way that we talk to each other.
And what you've just been saying there, Emily, about the whole kind of polarization conversation has reminded me about our conversation with Mike. And I guess the use of a phrase such as dangerous distraction. Mike and Friends of the Earth don't disagree with carbon removal. They kind of fundamentally disagree with the marketplace side of things. And that's, I think, where language is so key, to just be really clear.
Yeah, that's a great example. And, we talk about language so in depth and so closely analyze it because we're kind of worried about the public perception of this field that we know is super important. And the way that it's talked about, how often it's talked about, and all those things contribute to the public perception. We both said that one of the main reasons we were doing this show is because we feel like carbon removal isn't talked about enough. So we want to talk about it so that other people can talk about it. I mean, we're nearing the end of the season now, and I feel like I can comfortably say that we've achieved that to some extent. We are contributing to this conversation. It's a really complex and nuanced conversation. That's why it's taking us this long to have the conversation. But that's all part of it. That's sort of like the fun of it, right?
Another thing that I'm taking away from this episode in particular is going back to the kind of systemic challenge at hand here, in that we can't perhaps focus on either reduction or carbon removal. It needs the system as a whole to work together to kind of work forwards on this, having a pie big enough for everyone to kind of get a slice of. And at the same time, the challenge of the net zero saga that we have touched on from time to time, and the moral hazard, I guess, of just focusing on something like carbon removal over reducing your emissions, which we know first and foremost is the most important thing to be doing.
Yeah, that whole like slice of the pie thing, it's just, I think that is a really big question that touches on not just carbon removal, but so many points of like economic development. I would like to say, though, that we're talking about how important public perception is, and it really is. But I don't want this to be misconstrued as a call to mean every individual has to solve this problem. That's not what we're trying to say. And I think it's important to explicitly mention that, because sometimes the pressure of being like, oh my God, my opinion, my conversations matter so much. I need to do much more about this. It can be overwhelming. So, it is a collective problem. We need collective action, and we need collective responsibility, and we need collective care. We need to take care of each other in this. We need to take care of ourselves in this. I think that's just as important to recognize. That's also why I loved what Tom Mansfield said about this healing of the planet, that it's a caring process. It's not a fight, and it's not just a chore of fixing something. It's a caring process.
Yeah, it kind of makes me think of how the more you know about something, the more that you care, because you understand it better. So what we want is for people to understand this space more and be able to make a decision on how they want to support or perhaps not support it.
Yeah, exactly. Ultimately, for me, I just think about the what ifs in this scenario. What if the public don't consider carbon removal to be very important? Or what if they consider it to be super important? Those are two really different scenarios, right? What if people see this as completely impossible? What if people see this as difficult but doable? What if this is perceived as something that is really expensive and never going to get past the starting blocks? Or what if this is perceived as something that we need to band together to make possible and feasible? Those scenarios for me are super interesting. And, we all know which side I lie on, where I'm trying to push ourselves towards. And a lot of that comes down to the language you use, the way these things are perceived, the way we talk about these things. Yeah, I find that fascinating.
All of these what if questions, these little conversations we've just been having, are themes that we're going to be bringing into episode 9.
Final episode of season 1. If you feel inspired by what you've heard so far and wish you could do more to rid the atmosphere of carbon, then great news, you can. One of our sponsors, Patch, is the API first marketplace for negative emissions that makes it easy for businesses and their end customers to neutralise their carbon footprint.
Patch works with companies in crypto, fintech, e-commerce and more to embed carbon removal projects into their products and services, or provide their users with the option to purchase carbon removal right at checkout. That means businesses can build carbon negative products and features that enable climate action at scale.
Build something climate positive with Patch. Head to patch.io to learn how.
Thank you so much to our team who make this series possible.
Our researcher and fact checker, Henry Irvine.
Our composer, Sam Carter.
Our graphic designer, Reke Campbell.
Our editor, Mercy Barno.
Our producer, Ben Weaver-Hinks.
Our project manager, Patrick Carter.
And our executive producer, Sam Floy. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Carbon Removal Show. As ever, we encourage you to rate, subscribe, follow, send us to friends and family, whatever you want to do.
Join us next time for the season finale, where we look ahead and ask what's coming next for carbon removal.
Season finale. I hope we have champagne.
Co-Fruition.